Virginia Slaughter, our second speaker this morning, is professor and finds time also to be head of School of Psychology at the University of Queensland, where she also founded the Early Cognitive Development Centre. Her research focuses on social and cognitive development in infants and young children, with particular emphasis on social behaviour in infancy, theory of mind development, and the acquisition of peer interaction skills. So she can tell you how your child can become popular. It's actually not very difficult. They just have to show empathy, which I found very interesting. Her work on how children understand death has meant that she's often asked to comment in the wake of tragedies and major events like the shootings that we've had in Christchurch on how we should talk to children about death. And her advice in one word is truthfully. So, Virginia, please.
Thank you. Okay, so a concept of the afterlife is predicated on a concept of death. It's a very complex concept. So for adults, death and dying is overlaid with religious, social, emotional elements. Fundamentally, though, we recognize it as a biological event. It is the end of metabolism, really. That sounds simple, but acquiring a biologically accurate concept of death is something that takes quite a protracted time in early development, in the first 7 years of life or so. So children from around 3 or 4 can talk about death. And when you talk to children of this age about death, you find that their conception of death is as an activity. It's something that people do. But only some people do it. That is, old people or sick people. It's something that's avoidable if you do it in a different way. And it's pretty much conceptualized as an altered state of living the way we live here on Earth. So let me give you some examples. Going quite a way back, Maria Nagy kind of pioneered these interview-style studies of children's death concepts. In talking to groups of children in Hungary back in the 1940s, she kind of led the way in this research. And this is a little tedious, but I'll go ahead and read it out to you. Maria's doing an interview with one of her Hungarian participants, almost 5-year-old little girl. She says, "A dead person is just as if he were asleep. Sleeps in the ground, too." And Maria says, "Sleeps the same as you do at night or otherwise?" "Well, closes his eyes. Sleeps like people at night. Sleeps like that, just like that." Maria says, "Well, how do you know whether someone is asleep or dead?" And the child says, "I know if they go to bed at night and don't open their eyes. If somebody goes to bed and doesn't get up, he's dead or ill. Will he ever wake up? Never. A dead person only knows if somebody goes out to the grave or something. He feels that somebody is there or is talking. Are you certain? You're not mistaken? I don't think so. At funerals, you're not allowed to sing, just talk, because otherwise the dead person couldn't sleep peacefully. A dead person feels it if you put something on his grave." So clearly this child is likening death to sleep and is showing some confusion between sleep and illness. This little girl I tested some 20 years ago back in Boston. I asked her, "What does die mean?" She said, "It means you never come back, ever. Never see your mom and dad again." Okay, when a person is dead, do they need to eat? Yes, everyone needs to eat healthy, good food like carrots, melon, yogurt. When a person is dead, do they move around? Well, they walk around at night. When a person is dead, do they need water? Yes, because every person needs a drink. When a person is dead, do they use the toilet? No, they hold it in. Can a dead person ever come back to life? Well, if they take medicine, they can. All right, now let's contrast that with a mature death concept. From around the age of 7 or so, children's ideas about death become integrated with what they know about life, body functioning, illness. They understand it as the inevitable cessation of bodily functioning that happens to all living things. So little Luke, just a little bit older than the previous girl, answers my questions like this. What does die mean? I asked him. He said, that's when the body decomposes. It's in the ground and it rots. When a person is dead, do they need to eat? No, they're already dead. When a person is dead, do they move around? No, they're dead. Do they need to use the toilet? Of course not. What are some things that can die? Trees, animals, people, fish, anything that's alive. What are some things that cannot die? Subway cars, things that aren't alive in the first place, because everything that's alive has to die. Now, I think we can all recognize that this is the adult biological conception of death, a mature, biologically accurate understanding of it. Social, religious, and personal beliefs about the afterlife can be appended to this concept, but this core understanding of death is ultimately a biological one. Now, why does this matter? Well, immature death concepts can be quite confusing to children, especially if they're grieving. So they end up thinking, if they're thinking about death as an activity, then they wonder, well, why is Grandma insisting on doing that? Or when is it going to end? When will she come back? Here's a case example from the child clinical literature. Adam, aged 5, returned from school in a distressed state. It was difficult to establish what the problem was, but it seemed to focus on his reluctance to be in the Christmas nativity play. Adam's grandfather had died in the summer, and Adam understood from his parents that Granddad was with the angels in heaven. So Adam was not prepared to be an angel in the play because he thought he might die. And in fact, we did some research some years ago with Australian children where we evaluated their concepts of death in mature biological terms and their anxiety about death, and we found that there was an inverse relationship. So the more biologically accurately children understood death, the less anxious they were about death. So now I move to how do modern children learn about death? Cast your mind back. Before the age of 10, do you recall holding a newborn baby? Attending a baby naming ceremony of some kind? Viewing a human corpse? Attending a funeral? If you're like most people who I've asked these questions to, the latter two events would have been vanishingly rare in the first 10 years of your life. Much more common, you would have experienced the first two. In fact, I didn't see a corpse or attend a funeral until I was well into my 20s. In modern life, it's really just not all that common for children to be exposed to death. This is a departure from historical norms. So if we look at this graph of mortality rates, this is just the last century. They've declined tremendously, and this is American data, but it's pretty much true all over the world, but especially in Western industrialized countries. So in the 19th century, 2/3 of the population died before the age of 50. Death took place at home. Children were unavoidably exposed to it, and you'll see the most precipitous decline in mortality is in infant mortality. So most children would have had a sibling who died or have a friend who had a sibling who died in infancy. But these days, very few children die in infancy and childhood. Furthermore, when we do die, we don't do it at home. So this graph shows you the proportion of people who die in different locations by country. So the red bars represent the proportion of people who die in hospital, and then the orange bars are dying in some other medical facility that's not a hospital, and the light yellow bars represent the proportion of people who actually die at home. And you can see it varies by country, but at the bottom, the medians are there, and it's 1/3 of people across all of these countries who die in some place other than a medical facility, which could be at home or it could be something else like hospice. So death really is quite invisible to children. And then on top of that, adults shield children from the realities of death and dying. So protectionist attitudes abound. Here's some examples. 2013, British adults, nearly half of them, believed that it was inappropriate for children under the age of 12 to attend a funeral. And a recent survey of Canadian parents found that a quarter of them had never spoken about death and dying with their 2 to 8-year-old children. And I might just add at this moment that these protectionist attitudes make it very difficult to do this research. We're constantly battling, not so much against institutional ethical review boards, although there's a bit of a battle there, but it's mostly when it comes to gatekeepers and parents. They just don't want their children talking about death or being asked about death. So, in the face of all this, how do modern children learn the facts, the biological facts about death and dying? I'll quickly go over 3 sources of information. So intuitively, the most powerful source would be experiencing death of some kind. And when people do these sorts of studies, these correlational studies where they ask children or the parents of children if the child has had a pet die or grandma die, or there's been some other experience of death, and then the child is interviewed and asked what they know about death, there's really not a strong correlation there, and that's probably because the base rates are really low. Like I said, I never had a personal experience of death until I was into my 20s. There is some evidence that direct experience of death is related to an advanced biological understanding when the child has a lot of exposure, but most children don't have a lot of exposure in everyday life. Where they do get a lot of exposure is in the media, on television. So this famous statistic from now 19 years ago about how many murders American children see on TV, I couldn't find an updated statistic, but I doubt that it's dropped in that time. And in fact, you know, if you add on video game deaths, American and children around the world really are being exposed to lots and lots of death in the media. And if you're thinking, well, my children are safe, I only let them watch Disney Pixar movies, 84% of those movies have at least one death being portrayed. So maybe we think, well, this is good, because if they don't have it in real life, if they're not attending wakes or they're not sitting by their aged grandparents' deathbed, at least they're getting some exposure. Problem is, it's not necessarily very healthy exposure, so the majority of deaths that are portrayed on television are violent deaths, and the media can also produce really confusing messages. So an analysis of the Disney Pixar movies found that 20% of those deaths were actually portrayed as reversible, which just feeds into children's early conceptualization of death as something that you choose to do or not to do and that you can come back from. So that said, media can also promote very positive, realistic understandings of death. So there's not a vast, but a pretty big, but maybe not all that well-known children's literature on death, which grieving experts often point people to. And a few things on television that are useful. Sesame Street had a couple of segments on death. Probably the most famous one is Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the episode Death of a Goldfish, where he talked about death. He introduced it as a biological event and then talked about the social, emotional, and I think he even hinted at the religious ideas that revolve around that. And in fact, that episode went kind of viral on YouTube shortly after the Sandy Hook mass murder in the United States, as American parents were looking around for some source of information to help them talk to their children about that tragedy. So that's where we turn to the most important source of children's information about death, which is the way their parents communicate. So study after study shows that this is probably the most important source of children's information. And of course, it's linked to the others because parents talk to children about death when the children maybe have questions arising from direct experience or from exposure in the media. Now, bereavement experts have emphasized for decades that children need to hear frank, honest, biologically rooted talk when they're addressing the concept of death. Euphemisms and metaphors are well meant, trying to shield the child from a painful reality, but they actually just reinforce the immature understanding of death as an activity. So when you say, we lost her, she passed away, he's gone to a better place, yes, that avoids the immediate pain and discomfort of having to address the realities of death, but in the long run, it doesn't do children any good because it simply feeds into their confusion. So the last thing I want to show you is these data, which actually come from a study that was done here in New Zealand, a really unique study, where the researchers interviewed children and their parents separately. And the children were taken through a kind of standard death interview, and their understanding of different aspects of death as a biological event were scored on a 0 to 2 scale. And then the parents were asked for each of the questions the children were asked, the parents were asked to respond, what would your child answer to this? And what this graph indicates is that for each of these different subcomponents of a mature death understanding, parents underestimated what their children knew. The children's scores were higher than the parents expected them to be. So this suggests that children may be a lot more ready, and a lot more sophisticated in their understandings than parents realize. And so we may try to avoid the reality or even dumb things down for them when we don't need to do that. So I'm going to leave you with recommendations because people always ask for recommendations falling out of this. They're pretty straightforward and they're pretty commonsensical. Don't underestimate what young children understand about death. Beware of protectionist attitudes and euphemisms. Again, let me go back to the protectionist attitudes. When we do get access to children and we carry out these interviews, the children not only don't get upset, but they enjoy it a lot. They seem to really relish the opportunity to talk about this thing that they know is there and that they know is highly emotionally charged, but nobody wants to engage with them. As parents, it's important that we curate media portrayals of death, and we should allow children direct experience of death if they're interested. I asked my mother, why didn't I get to go to Izzy's funeral? Izzy was my great-grandmother with whom I was very, very close. She died when I was 7 years old, and my mother said, well, we didn't think that you should be exposed to that. We didn't think you were ready for it. I really wish I'd had that opportunity to learn. So that's it for me, and I'll turn over now to our next speaker, Jessie.